Welcome back. Long time no see.
Oh, hi there, guys. It's Mrs. Klein.
And Mrs. Wilbrin, and we are here to talk to you about the abolition movement. Reformers in the 19th century didn't have cell phones or social media to spread the word. Instead, they wrote letters and newspaper articles, gave speeches, and even sent secret messages to communicate their ideas. The main idea of this section: brave individuals spoke out about the injustices of slavery in an attempt to end the institution in the United States.
Okay, speaking out against slavery. Many reformers who spoke out about social issues were also abolitionists, or people who wanted to end slavery. However, some Americans did not agree with abolitionists. Southerners and Northerners alike considered abolitionists and their ideas too radical, as well as dangerous, unchristian, and even unpatriotic. Unchristian, that's really remarkable. Yeah.
In 1831, an abolitionist named William Lloyd Garrison published the first issue of his newspaper, The Liberator. His paper called for the immediate emancipation or freedom of all enslaved people. Wendell Phillips, a wealthy attorney, soon allied with Garrison. He wrote for The Liberator and contributed financially to the movement.
In 1839, former President John Quincy Adams argued that the ideals of the Declaration of Independence applied to all people. He called for a constitutional amendment to make every child born in the United States after July 4th, 1842, free. He also proposed that no new state could enter the Union if it allowed slavery, but neither idea became law. Guys, it's important for you to realize he wasn't a very successful president, but he comes back and he continues to serve in the Senate, I think, for years to come, and really has a lot to offer there.
Yes. Now, we want you to look at this image because what this man is wearing is called the iron collar. And it was one of the most horrifying tools slave owners subjected enslaved people to. They used this device to punish slaves, especially for attempts to escape. The prongs made it impossible to lie down, to rest, or sleep. They also caught on bushes and underbrush, making it hard to run. Abolitionists pointed to this kind of cruelty in demanding an end to slavery.
Two sisters, Sarah Grimke and Angelina Grimke, witnessed the cruelty of slavery firsthand while growing up on their parents' plantation in South Carolina. When the sisters took up the abolitionist cause, as some Southerners did, their family disowned them. These determined women joined the Quakers and traveled the country giving speeches in support of abolition. In 1863, Angelina Grimke married fellow abolitionist Theodore Weld, a trainer and recruiter for the American Anti-Slavery Society.
Okay, next section is Standing Up for Freedom. Both free and enslaved African Americans actively challenged the existence of slavery. David Walker was a free African American man who wrote for Freedom's Journal, an abolitionist newspaper. As the owner of a secondhand clothing store in Boston in the 1820s, Walker printed anti-slavery pamphlets and sewed them into the pockets of clothing he sold to sailors.
Right on.
Walker hoped the pamphlets would reach people in many ports, especially those in the South. One of his pamphlets, entitled An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, became one of the most radical anti-slavery documents of the movement, and Southern states reacted by prohibiting the circulation of abolitionist literature. Wasn't he poisoned? David Walker?
I think so.
I think he was too.
Okay, another African-American abolitionist was Charles Remond, who was born to a wealthy, free African-American family in Salem, Massachusetts. He worked as an agent of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, and he traveled and spoke with Garrison, Phillips, and others.
Robert Purvis was the son of a wealthy cotton broker and free African-American woman. When he was 9 years old, his family moved from South Carolina to Philadelphia. As an adult, Purvis became very active in abolition and in the Underground Railroad. In fact, he and his wife, Harriet Fortin, housed escapees in their home, also known as the Purvis Safe House.
At the beginning of the chapter,
we're actually going to talk about Harriet Tubman later.
Yes, we are going to talk about Harriet Tubman after this lesson. Okay, so we're going to find out a little bit about Harriet Tubman. Other African American women played significant roles in the abolitionist movement as well. Harriet Jacobs, born into slavery, escaped to New York in 1842. She published Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl in 1861, which is considered one of the most extensive slave narratives ever written by a woman.
Sojourner Truth was also a powerful abolitionist voice. Like Tubman and Jacobs, Truth was born into slavery. When she told a white neighbor that her owner broke his promise to release her, the neighbor paid the owner $20 for her and then set her free. She changed her enslaved name, Isabella, to Sojourner Truth. She captivated people with her simple, clear message that all people deserved the same rights as white men.
Okay, all right. Here are some questions to consider. How did abolitionists work to end slavery?
And why did most Americans consider abolitionists' ideas radical?
Okay, all right, we're going to move on to the next section, which has to do with the women's rights movement and Seneca Falls. Like activists in modern civil rights movements, 19th century activists in the women's rights movement felt an urgent sense of purpose. And when it came to establishing basic rights for women, failure was impossible. Main idea for this lesson is in 1848, supporters of women's rights laid the groundwork for a movement that would change the lives of American women.
Okay. Leaders for women's rights. Throughout the early 1800s, women played active roles in social reform and abolition movements. Yet, women continued to occupy a secondary place to men in society. When women earned wages outside of the home, their pay was much lower than the wages men received for doing the same job. Married women could not own or purchase property or enter into contracts. Single women had all the property rights a man had, but were taxed on that property by a government in which they had no voice.
Yep. No taxation without representation.
Exactly. It's coming back.
Yep.
Furthermore, because educational and career opportunities were so limited for women, marriage was often the only possible path to a financially stable life for most women.
The fight for women's rights had its roots in the abolition movement. Female abolitionists gained public speaking and organization experience, and some began to ask why women were not granted the same rights as men. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott were early leaders in the women's rights movement, and both were abolitionists.
Elizabeth Cady came from a wealthy family and received an excellent education at the Troy Female Seminary. She married abolitionist Henry Brewster Stanton, became an abolitionist herself, and met many other abolitionists, including Lucretia Mott. Mott was a Quaker from Massachusetts who housed escapees traveling on the Underground Railroad.
In 1848, Mott and Stanton organized the Seneca Falls Convention in central New York. There, they issued a Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. The Declaration of Sentiments framed the injustices faced by women in familiar language. As you know, the Declaration of Independence introduced the idea that all men are created equal. The Declaration of Sentiments inserted "and women" into that fundamental idea to reinforce the assertion that all men and women are created equal. In this spirit, Stanton went a step further and included women's suffrage, or the right to vote, in the Declaration of Sentiments. She knew opponents of women's suffrage would claim the demand was outrageous and that it might hinder the acceptance of other ideas about women's rights. But because Stanton believed the right to vote was essential, she and Mott listed it as their first grievance in the Declaration of Sentiments.
Okay, continuing the work. In 1851, Sojourner Truth, who had attended Seneca Falls, delivered a powerful speech at the Women's Right Convention in Ohio. She asked, "Ain't I a woman?" and drew attention to the race in the fight for women's rights. Truth was a passionate supporter of equality for men and women of all races. That same year, Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Susan B. Anthony. Coming from a Quaker family, Anthony supported both temperance and abolition. The two women began a friendship and a political partnership that lasted more than 50 years. They traveled together, delivered speeches to lawmakers, planned campaigns, and published The Revolution, a newspaper devoted to women's rights.
During the 1850s and 1860s, issues regarding women's rights became less pressing because of the impending Civil War. However, after the war was over, women's rights activists picked up the cause again. In 1869, Anthony and Stanton founded the National Women's Suffrage Association, the first national women's rights organization. Anthony believed that the best way to bring attention to women's suffrage was to violate the law by voting. When she tried to vote in the 1872 election, she was arrested and fined. Anthony never paid the fine and never went to jail.
The campaign for women's rights began in the early 1800s and continued through the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th. Some leaders worked until the day they died. Mott, Stanton, Truth, Anthony, and many other women's rights activists dedicated their lives to securing political and social equality for women.
You guys, in fact, there's a quote. If you're opening up the book, I want to read the quote that in 1902, so years and years after they began their fight, Susan B. Anthony wrote to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, "It is 51 years since we first met, and we have been busy through every single one of them, stirring up the world to recognize the rights of women." So I had to fight for a very long time.
Yes. Okay, just some questions to think about since we finished that section. What was the Seneca Falls Convention and why was it significant?
In what ways were the movements for abolition and women's rights intertwined?
And how did women's rights activists link women's rights to the Founding Fathers' position on equality and natural rights?
All the best to you guys.
Later.